Today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners, who for more than 25 years have successfully delivered interim and permanent leadership talent to transform businesses. To hire the talent you need to enable your business to thrive, visit www.progressotalent.com today. Hey listeners, on this episode of Extrology, I'm honoured to welcome Eoin Murray, a visionary in sustainable investing, nature finance and biodiversity strategies. From leading investments at Federated Hermes to pioneering the Seed Biocomplexity Index, Eoin has spent decades at the forefront of innovation, connecting finance with nature to create a more sustainable future. But Eoin's journey is more than his achievements. It's about a profound curiosity for how we can balance profit and purpose, capitalism and conservation, and our relentless drive for growth with the urgent need to protect our planet. Today we'll uncover the experiences and ideas that have shaped his career, the lessons he's learned along the way, and his bold vision for a world where business becomes a force for environmental restoration. So what's the story behind the story? Without further ado, let's get into it. Eoin Murray, welcome to Extrology. Great to have you here as my guest today. Where in the world might we find you today?
Good morning, Lee. You're finding me at home in rural Devon, in the middle of the Blackdown Hills, just getting over the electricity power cuts that we enjoyed over the weekend with the most recent storms.
And nothing else untoward as a consequence of Storm Dara doing its best? Is it, I say, just a power cut? Clearly that's incredibly inconvenient at the very least, but there was no other, trees down, structural damage, anything like that to be concerned about?
Yeah, not on domestic property here. I'm sure in the surrounding neighbourhood there's plenty of that, and there are big chunks of Devon and northern Somerset that are still, in fact, without power. So a fairly devastating weekend overall, I think.
Well, that leads us nicely in that there'll be much to discuss, I'm sure, with respect to climate, environment, and all those good things, critical topics today. But before we get into that, I wanted to take an exploration of the journey, and in particular, your career, which has taken you from leading quant teams to driving nature finance initiatives. Was there a defining moment or realization that shifted your focus towards sustainability and biodiversity?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, possibly not the most obvious path to leap from geek to a tree hugger, but it's one that I've made. I think probably in the middle of the last decade, in between jobs, struggling with purpose and trying to figure out, well, how could I actually make a meaningful contribution in the world of investing, contemplating alternatives, working out that actually are completely unqualified to do anything else in the world, and then it coming to me that actually the value add that I could bring was around helping nudge investing and finance more generally down this path of sustainability, as we call it. And you're very lucky at that time to pick up a job with a large leading sustainable asset manager and being able to help drive progress down that path.
And were there any particular role models or influences or experiences, circumstances that led you to uncover that purpose around sustainability?
Yeah, I think there probably have been at least a couple of role models on the journey. And, both of them have come from the academic world. I should say, actually, all three of them have come from the academic world. They're involved in things like the planetary boundaries. They're involved in the global tipping points movement. And then more recently, some of the work that I've been doing with ETH in Zurich, with Professor Tom Crowther, has been particularly around how we measure the state of nature in a meaningful way that retains all of its complexity whilst giving you a single indicator that we can use for the measuring and to make sure that capital starts to flow to the parts of the economy that we need that capital to be moving towards.
And so was the let's call it the outdoors for the sake of any clumsiness from my perspective, but was the outdoors a big part of your life growing up? Have you always preferred perhaps more time away from a desk climbing a tree as opposed to at a desk itself?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I born in Glasgow, in the city itself, which isn't the most rural of environments, but moved at a very young age north up into the Trossachs, so the sort of start of the Highlands, if you like, and very lucky to be in a family where literally as kids we were sort of encouraged to be outdoors any time of day. It struck me at the time as particularly if it was cold and rainy, I was sent outdoors, and no great fear back in those days if I didn't appear back until sort of dinner time, having left just after breakfast. So that was a really wonderful way to grow up. And yeah, that I think that probably defined my childhood, and then subsequently sort of my interest in being in the outdoors now. And actually, it's now reached a point where my mindfulness is best achieved when I'm out in nature. And that can be as simple as just walking the dogs up the hill behind me here. And an hour and a half out in nature, great way to clear the mind, great way to reflect on maybe some of the thornier issues that you're wrestling with at a particular point in time, and come back and you're refreshed and sort of ready to go again.
I think that's fascinating. It struck me that for the longest time, certainly through the course of my working life, so much of the emphasis was on doing, broadly speaking. So this sense of productivity, this sense of doing something. So we seemed to have gotten to a place whereby we would reward activity and had lost the virtue of thinking, or taking that time out, as you say, to be mindful, to actually work an issue through, or work a process through, with the expectation, certainly in my experiences, was that solving problems was about doing things rather than about thinking about doing things. And it just strikes me that we're starting to see that shift come back. Do you think is that reflective of your own experience?
Yeah, I think it is. And, maybe that's one of the blessings of the pandemic. And there aren't many,
No.
but one of them, I think, is at the time, there was very clearly a recognition that we should measure things by output, not input. And I think that's been a very valuable lesson. Now, I would say, there's been a little bit of sort of redressing that balance towards, well, how much are you working? How much are you putting in? But I think for the most part, there is that general recognition that I myself work better having had, my time in nature. I'm a more productive person and my output is vastly superior. And I think that's a great thing to be conscious of, and certainly something that I would encourage with everybody that I have the privilege to work with.
I think coming back to investment, in fact, I was having the conversation on the podcast yesterday about the virtues of reading. And in particular, we were talking about Warren Buffett, who I understand reads somewhere between 3 and 5 hours a day. So we have had for the longest time, this myopic focus on producing something, doing something, or perceived as doing something. And yet too often, I don't know about you, but certainly there's been times in my life where I've been challenged by someone who's asked me to do something because I was reading a book, I wasn't doing anything. Often a comment that would have been made. And yet here we are, arguably one of the world's greatest, certainly in terms of success factors, if we measure those by return on investment and monetarily, arguably one of the most effective investors the world has ever known, reads somewhere between 3 to 5 hours a day. So I think it's interesting that we actually, from an investment perspective, having time to think, analyze, absorb, consider, I'd imagine that's critical to a successful outcome, I'd imagine. Certainly Buffett bears that out.
Yeah, no, clearly he does, and his track record speaks for itself. For me, there's something in there about learning. And I kind of always said that the day that I stop learning is probably the day that I need to quit working, because it's incredibly important to me. When we started down this journey of nature investing, I knew that I was going to be deploying capital into things that I didn't fully understand. So I felt absolutely obliged to go back to, my studies. I did a master's in sustainable aquaculture for that very reason. I thought if I'm investing in seaweed farming, if I'm investing in oyster restoration projects, seagrass, whatever it is, I kind of need to understand what's going on if I'm to make those capital decisions, particularly when it's not my capital I'm investing, or at least the majority of it is not. And that felt really important to me, as I must continue with my learning to be good at what I do.
I read that you describe your path as one influenced by luck and accident, which then led me to ask the question as to the role that you think serendipity plays in shaping meaningful careers.
I definitely do think serendipity is a huge influence. And just taking my own experience, anytime I've tried to, you come up with a 3 to 5 year plan, and it's the classic interview question, isn't it? Where do you see yourself in 3 or 5 years? Those things, they never go according to plan. So serendipity plays a huge role. I would say along the way, I've been really lucky to have had a couple of mentors who, for one reason or another, have taken a shine to me and what I might bring, and have given me the freedom to, to grow and to become a better investor. And I shall be, I'm always going to be eternally grateful to those individuals. And in that sense, that's luck. That had nothing to do with, anything particular that I brought, putting me in contact with those particular individuals at that point in time. So yeah, serendipity, I think, is underrated.
Is there a pivotal moment, perhaps, that you think has been the most influential within your own career?
No, I don't think there's been one pivotal moment, but there have been sort of several. I've been really lucky several times to have been involved with, at an early stage, in particular aspects of investing. So back in the early 90s, quant was a very niche activity. In many investment houses, the quants sort of sat in the corner, they ran their risk reports, they took them over to the real grown-up fund managers who looked at them and said, thank you very much, and put the pieces of paper into the round receptacle at their side. But wonderful experience for me as a recent graduate to be involved in that whole movement. Move on to, the world of private debt in the sort of the middle and early part of last decade. Post-global financial crisis, we had the banks exiting lending to big chunks of the market. Again, wonderful to be able to bring on and grow a private debt team in my previous outfit in a market that was sort of starting from nothing and growing rapidly. And then move forward a third time, and I think that's incredibly rare, is to have the 3 goes at this, to be right at the beginning of the development of the nature markets, which is where I think we are today. I mean, let's go back. It's only a couple of years ago that Sir Partha Dasgupta wrote his seminal work on why we should value nature. Great that it's already seeped into our industry, but we are at the beginning of something that I think could be absolutely huge and should be for very good reason.
It's interesting. Why now? What is it that gives you that? And I should explain this to the thought that's come to mind and why, therefore, I asked the question. I look at, arguably, we can debate the whys and wherefores and the reality, the actual factual evidence as to what I'm about to describe. But if we look at what is conceivably the most powerful position on the planet, that of the President of the United States, whom I believe through the election process was, uttering phrases like "drill, baby, drill," and espousing the virtues of fossil fuels as what ultimately was required to fund economic growth. So there is a sort of a shift, isn't there, in rhetoric, I sense, not based again on any factual evidence, just an intuitive sense of how I see the world, but there's sort of a pushback against maybe nature investing, for example, looking at sustainability, the long-term future of the planet, to forego that for short-term gain. Does that concern you? And I guess, therefore, why now do you see we're at this point where nature investing gets to be really interesting, really exciting?
So I think, you're in part right, in the sense that I think we will, for the next 4 years, see a pushback, at least against investing that is attempting to address climate change. And I think that's almost inevitable. So, when we think about how we might sequester carbon, we've got 2 choices. We can either invest in the technology that we require, or we can invest in nature-based solutions. Typically 40-60 appears to be the ratio of nature to technology type solutions. Now, that may sit take a bit of a back seat over the next 4 years. But the bit of nature investing that I think will continue to drive forward is, in part, our recognition that nature provides a whole load of ecosystem services which are essential to our living on this planet, and that as we have more and more extreme events, Storm Dara being our most recent experience this past weekend, that there's a recognition that actually investing in nature will help us adapt to those new extreme event conditions. And there's stuff that we can be doing outside of this climate change world, which is just very much focused on nature, which doesn't appear to attract the same opprobrium, if you like, from, as you say, the president and his colleagues in the States.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think to the extent that they're investing in nature doesn't necessarily mean I'm excluding a particular other group, whereas there's the sense that I think investing in renewables, I'm pushing out the whole fossil fuel industry. And clearly that's a very influential and powerful lobby. I think investing in nature is sort of something new that we just really haven't thoroughly thought through properly in the past. And therefore, it doesn't appear to hit the same obstacles as investing in the renewable world.
I do want to come on and talk about, for example, valuing and restoring biodiversity. We'll come on to that. But one of the things that strikes me about the challenge with fossil fuels is not only the emphasis on the word fuel. So if we look at the role that oil plays in our lives at large, in just about in some, I don't really know what the specific percentages are, but just how many products that we consume daily across the globe, in some way, shape or form, oil features in that supply chain, whether it's in the product itself or whether it's the delivery of that product. It's so integrated when you start to unpick it that actually we're going to require 7 billion of us to undergo enormous societal change in terms of the products we use, not least the things we consume, in order that we can ultimately move away from our reliance on digging holes in the ground and sucking up all the natural resources that we enjoy.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And that's why we should talk very clearly and openly about the need to transition. And inevitably, it will probably be slower than one would want if we're only considering climate change. But if it's necessary that we take people on a journey so that changes can be made, which makes sure that job losses in one particular sector are offset by training that's available for the new sectors that come online, then I think that's what we must do. The truth is, it means that we'll probably, if we are to achieve our climate change targets, it probably means that we will end up with a disorderly transition towards the middle of the century. And that's unfortunate. But at least if we're in that position, then at least we are getting there. It won't be as quickly as many of us would have wanted, but at least we're getting there.
If I look at your work with the Seed Biocomplexity Index, there was a focus on valuing and restoring biodiversity. How do you see that transforming the way businesses and governments approach sustainability?
Yes, I think there are a number of different things going on at the moment. Clearly, we had a couple of years ago the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed COP15, Kunming, Montreal. And more recently, we had COP16. Now, headlines there would be that we didn't make as much progress as we would have liked. But it's very clear that many major governments around the world, and this is a voluntary framework, the GBF, are already pursuing the targets that are contained within that framework. The National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, NBSAPs. And I think over the next couple of years, we'll see further evidence of governments and state actors pushing in that direction. At the same time, on the corporate side, I think corporates are waking up to the fact that their long supply chains are vulnerable to climate change and nature loss. And actually, so to be a sustainable business, i.e. a business that is here for the long term, one needs to protect those. And I think that means that many corporate entities are now looking at nature and biodiversity on a much more sort of serious basis and trying to protect the parts that they rely on. So I think you've got two different movements going on, and that's before we get to various of the frameworks that are regulatory frameworks that are now super important to corporates all over the world, but particularly in Europe. CSRD, the EU deforestation law, even though it's been postponed by a year, and then voluntary frameworks like the Task Force for Nature related financial disclosures, TNFD. I think there's a whole load of sort of reasons for this momentum towards taking nature and biodiversity loss a little bit more seriously.
If you're therefore positioning nature as if you like critical business infrastructure, what do you think are the biggest challenges in persuading industries to see nature in this way?
So nature as critical business infrastructure is going to be essential to how we think about things in the future. And the way I sort of conceive of it is we have alternatives in terms of how we adapt to extreme weather events in particular, and whether that's storms and flood risk, whether it's on the other side, whether it's drought, we have a choice of, we need to take better care of, for example, the water resource that our planet gives us. So we've got two choices. We can go down the route of hard engineering. We can build a bigger seawall that stops sea flood coming inland, or we can create significant weirs across rivers to hold water in the upper catchment areas. Again, there are nature alternatives to these, which I see as being critical business infrastructure, because they prevent flooding or drought further down river catchment areas that cause a huge amount of economic damage. So nature as a means to provide critical business infrastructure has been massively underrated, but I think its time is absolutely, coming now.
There's always this, and I think you've spoken about it, this uneasy relationship between capitalism and conservation. I wonder, do you believe that they are forces that can truly coexist, or do perhaps we need a fundamental economic shift for that to happen?
So I actually think we probably need a fundamental economic shift, and I suspect that will horrify many. But equally, I don't think it's something that we can do in isolation. So I think our current system doesn't really properly allow for nature to be taken into account. And so there's part of me that says, well, we need a new system. And it's great that people are working on that. I think at the same time, however, we need to work and operate within the existing system and do as much as we can within the system that we have today. And I think those two things have to sort of go in parallel. Ultimately, if we get to a point where, we've done our work that has conceived of this is what the new system looks like, our new economic system, a complete overhaul, then it will be great to switch across. But I think the realist in me says we're not quite there today, so we need both.
And so that fundamental economic shift to which you refer, what is it? What is it that needs to change?
So I think it's a new system in which many of our values are probably reconsidered and reconceived. So let's not kid ourselves that we've had wonderful progress over the last several centuries, and there are countries around the world which are only just beginning to enjoy those, and a lot of those have come from having an energy source as powerful as that provided by fossil fuels. But at the same time, we've had an economic system that has taken no account of nature. In fact, one could argue it's put a value on nature, but that value is zero. And we know that resources are not infinite. And unless we're more serious and take proper account of the wonder of nature and the value that it gives us, then eventually our current economic system runs out of steam. And that's not great for us. Nature will carry on regardless, but it's not entirely clear to me that on our current path, the human race would continue on regardless.
I have this really crude theory, not based on any factual evidence, but I'll run with it nonetheless, of this concept of when need becomes must. So I think we all, the vast majority of us, clearly there are lots of varying views on who's responsible for climate change. It strikes me that from a personal perspective, we have always had climate change. My sense is we are clearly contributing significantly to its acceleration. but nonetheless, and doing damage as a consequence. So things are changing. But I think that for many, it's that sort of, we all know things need to change. But unfortunately, until something seismic happens that forces us into a position where we have no choice, and that's a sort of worse, almost doomsday type scenario. But it almost strikes me that human nature is in terms of the overarching kind of populace, if you like, that make that decision. We're always going to have really well-meaning actors, great intellect, great innovation, always going on in the background. We're always going to have that. But in terms of consensus, until we get to a point where something must happen or we've no choice, the alternative is the end of the human race. So let's put it in those forms. That sort of need becomes must thing is what drives or motivates much of our action. And that's what concerns me, that it's possibly going to have to take something arguably horrific before people will finally, before we get the fundamental economic shift to which you refer. And that is a cause for concern, I think.
Yeah, no, I love your theory. I'm a buyer. For me, it's got something to do with until we experience the effects of climate change, nature, biodiversity loss personally, it's very difficult to motivate a change in action. And it's very easy for us today. We sit here in the West and we say, well, our contributions to the problems are decreasing. Our use of fossil fuels is less. And to point to the developing world and say, well, on a production basis, that's where all the carbon is coming from. If we flip that round and instead say, well, let's look at this through a consumption lens, we know perfectly well that it's the wealthiest 1% on the planet that are contributing around about 50%, if not more, of our carbon emissions today. And that's a really sort of worrying factor for me. This idea that it's our consumption patterns in the West really haven't changed anywhere near what we would require them to have done. And that all comes back to this idea that for the most part, yet we haven't quite experienced the effects of climate change personally enough. Now, I do think that's changing. And, no question. And again, this is somewhat anecdotal, but it is lived experience that the extreme weather events that we've had are on the increase, and increase not just in frequency, but also in severity.
Yeah.
And that's a direct consequence. And maybe it is a sad fact of our lives that it's that will cause us to take more serious action and responsibility ultimately.
How much do you think the concept of growth, which, it strikes me is central to modern economics, almost obsessively so, how much is therefore this obsession with growth a contributing factor? I think is the idea of degrowth a feasible one, if there is such a word, in today's world? Because that's one of the things that strikes me. I'm not an economist, clearly. My question would evidence that. But we've, this constant, all we ever hear about is GDP growth, GDP growth, GDP growth. I mean, I think Keir Starmer, one of his opening gambits was, we're going to be the fastest growing economy in the G7. I think was one of the measures he was looking to move towards. So we've got this obsession with growth. And is that not, given what you said about consumption, is that not a big part of the problem, that obsession in itself is we're kind of eating ourselves?
Yeah, no, and I do desperately worry about growth, both in a sort of an absolute construct, but also just in how we measure it. I mean, we're talking about GDP, and going back to our recent experience this weekend with Storm Dara. Storm Dara will have, bizarrely, in some sense, increased our GDP because there'll be economic activity to repair some of the damage that's been done. And that will inflate our GDP measure. Now, on the flip side, of course, the damage itself, which has reduced economic activity, will have lowered it. But isn't that weird? You can have a prison riot, and that prison riot, where we need to go in and possibly repair the prison, is a boost to GDP. So we know that there are problems with GDP as a metric. I think there are really good alternatives out there. But unless everybody is willing to embrace those, then I think we get into all manner of difficulty. And the obsession with growth does worry me. Many years ago, I was introduced to this wonderful expression called the Kaya identity, which essentially says, look, if we've got this target to reduce carbon, then it's a function of four things: population growth, GDP per capita, energy intensity, carbon intensity. And actually, if we're to have any hope of achieving carbon reduction that we want, then unfortunately, we almost certainly do have to go into a period of degrowth. And that will horrify so many people. The idea that degrowth is necessary to achieve our required reduction in carbon. I only see it as a problem if degrowth means that one part of society benefits at the expense of others. If everybody experiences it, then maybe it's not such a bad thing. Again, I think that might horrify some people. But if that's what it takes for us ultimately to, rethink our entire economic system, and as you say, to move away from this obsession with growth, particularly when it's measured in this very singular fashion, then perhaps that's what we have to do.
Do you think it can be, this idea of degrowth, if you like, do you think it can be balanced with the need to improve lives globally?
I think they're inextricably linked, no question. But selling that to people as a concept, that's the tricky thing. Do governments that are in power, at least in the developed world, typically for a 4 or 5 year period, do they have any incentive to embark on those more difficult conversations? I don't think they do.
No, I agree.
And so actually, it's very difficult to have those conversations in our current political construct.
I had a similar view with respect to education and impact on skills for the workplace. If I think when I went to university, I think I'm right in saying 9% of the population would have a university education. That's a small number, too small, arguably. So rightly, successive governments invested heavily in affording more opportunity for people to undertake higher education, and rightly so. But at the detriment, at the time, as I saw it, to more vocational qualifications and pursuits. Apprenticeships would be one. So we've now got a consequence whereby you can't get a plumber or an electrician for love nor money because there just aren't enough of them. So successive governments almost went down this path of pushing higher education to the detriment of vocational education, and it almost became, for a spell perhaps through the 90s, maybe the noughties, whereby if you didn't have a university degree, you were failing in some way, shape or form. Absolute nonsense, but that was the sort of the feeling that it left you with. And I think it's similar. I recognise why no government is ever going to want to say less people went to university this year than last year, or less people, there were less A grades at A level this year than there were last year, whatever it may be. It's the same thing with growth. What government is going to want to come into power and say, this year we grew less, the economy contracted, and that's a really good thing because look at the impact that it's had on our environment. I recognise that sort of the political damage that does, the political capital you lose as a consequence, and a stick with which that gets, to beat successive, regardless of your political persuasions, successive governments are going to get beaten with. So this is a really complex problem to try and solve politically, not least, as well as societally.
Yeah, no, 100%. This is a problem that doesn't just tap into economics, as you say, it taps into politics. It's deeply ingrained within our society that we must have this mythical growth, measured in the incorrect way, that doesn't necessarily produce improvements in our well-being. And I think until we sort of grasp that in everything, we're really going to struggle to make the meaningful change that we need. Again, which brings us back to this idea that we need to be pursuing both of these paths. One, which is looking to help transform our current system, as well as, okay, can we have another thrust at, is there an alternative system that we should be looking at?
I'm interested in your I guess what drives you, Eoin, in many ways. You've enjoyed a really diverse career spanning finance, leadership, and sustainable investment. What keeps you motivated and inspired to take on such complex challenges?
I think my current motivation is principally 2 grandsons and thinking through what I might leave, how I might leave when I depart this planet, what condition I might leave the planet in. And I feel like I've had this huge privilege of a particular lifestyle, and I want the same choices and opportunities to be available to my grandsons. I want to be able to look them in the face at some point in the future when they decide that they want to talk about something other than aquanauts, and we can have a meaningful discussion about, well, what did I actually do? And I won't be embarrassed. So it's a weird motivation, but it's a very real one.
I don't think it's weird. What about success? What does success mean to you today? And how has that definition evolved over your career?
Gosh, I think it's probably massively evolved over my career. I think there probably have been various points in my past that I wouldn't necessarily be terribly proud of, where success was conceived of only in sort of financial terms. But I'm delighted to say that those times are long behind me. And I actually think success for me these days is a lot more about creating opportunity for those that are typically younger, smarter, more able to enact change than I will ever be. So if I have a position of relative seniority, and then it behooves me to make room for others to do what they can.
You've worked with a number of very real innovations, really innovative initiatives like the UK Nature Investment Fund, and I'm intrigued to understand perhaps the most valuable lesson you've learned about leading transformative projects.
Gosh, I think number one lesson for me in terms of leading transformation is that I very, very rarely have all of the answers myself. In fact, if any of the answers. And actually, it's about pulling together teams, often from very disparate backgrounds, in a way that hasn't necessarily been terribly common in the investment world, but that says, actually, I need pockets of expertise at all different levels, and being able to join the dots around those. So I think to a large extent, when I have been involved in those transformative projects, that's my role has been limited to that. And it's having had the privilege of working with others who've had great ideas that I've been able to give them space to run with.
And I think I'd imagine, that balancing the pressures to deliver short-term results with the responsibility to create long-term impact has been something that you've had to wrestle with throughout your career. What advice might you give, or how do you think perhaps that individual leaders and entrepreneurs can balance the pressure to deliver those short-term results with the responsibility to create long-term impact to which we've referred?
It's really, really tricky, isn't it? I mean, I think there's a sense in which, there is a balance that needs to happen. And as much as we hate it, there is a sense in which one needs to get some quick wins, because that buys you the time and the license then to pursue maybe the longer term outcomes that you really desire. And from the world of investing, one of the things that I did in my last job, and this sounds extremely trite and trivial, was to just change the way in which we reported our investment performance. So typically you had a little table with the short-term sort of quarterly result at the top, then the yearly, then maybe the 3-year annualized, and so on. And no great contribution on my part other than to say, well, why don't we just flip these? Because it's amazing how people's focus will go to the top of a particular table of figures first. And that was a really subtle attempt to shift people's mindsets and to indirectly persuade them that they really should be paying most attention to the longer term outcomes, which I thought were the most important.
I'm struck by a conversation that I enjoyed over, and as evidenced by what I'm about to describe, it was clear that wine was involved, too much of it, but with my oldest friend many years ago. But at the time, his company was doing business with both the Chinese and the US at a time when you could do that. And I actually asked him as, throwaway remark as to what he saw as the difference between the two. And crudely speaking, he said the best way to describe it is, he said, if I'm having a conversation in the US, the general rhetoric is one of, well, how does that impact this quarter's outcome? what is the impact this quarter, or maybe this month, this week even? What is the impact of doing that now? What outcome will that drive today? Whereas when I'm speaking with the Chinese, the whole conversation centers around what does this look like for our grandchildren? This sense of legacy. And he said, I just get this sense with the Chinese that they've been going about this very steadily in the background for a very long period of time, and they are in it for the long haul. And we've got this sort of classic East versus West kind of almost culturally, societally, philosophical difference of perspectives on today versus tomorrow. And my sense in the human will, I'm an eternal optimist, but my hope has always been that we might meet somewhere in the middle and start to balance out the need for what today must bring us to, what we can sustain by way of legacy for tomorrow. But it strikes me we're some way off that. But nonetheless, I think for many, that sense of the scale of environmental challenges, bringing it back to the environment, it's overwhelming for a lot of people. What small steps do you think that people could take if they feel like they want to contribute to meaningful change? What should we be doing in our own lives? What actions can we undertake that can make that contribution?
There's a wonderful story which I think comes from the Bible, which is this might be a first for me, quoting something from the Bible. So I'm not necessarily a particularly religious person in that sense. And there's a question asked of this old farmer who's planting new olive bushes as to, well, why are you bothering? You're not going to be alive to see the results of your activity. And of course, his response is quite sensible. Well, this is for generations to come. And maybe that's the mentality that we need. And actually, I see that coming back into application with things like sort of regenerative farming practices. So, we're rethinking the whole sort of industrial approach to we just need to maximize yield without any consideration for the damage that's being done to our soil. And you have these concepts being chucked around of, we've only got 60 harvests left or whatever the number is. And I'm not sure I've seen any scientific evidence to support it, but there's clearly a deep concern that around the damage that we're doing to the soil. And maybe this is the whole purpose of the regenerative farming movement, to say, actually, we really need to take care of the soil, because that is going to be my livelihood in years, if not decades to come. And, having this proper, soil carbon sponge that holds and takes water, provides nutrients, is absolutely critical. And if we continue with the old industrial practices, we'll end up with a sandy desert. There's absolutely no good to farming and for food security in any sense whatsoever.
What's one, if you like, a common misconception about sustainable investing or nature finance that you wish more people understood?
I think one of the biggest mistakes that we made with the whole sort of sustainable investing movement was to give it the 3-letter acronym ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Whilst I think that does, in one sense, it does a great job of capturing 3 different buckets, the different types of factors one would want to think, somehow there was a notion that they could be amalgamated and conceived of in just one acronym. And I don't think that was ever the intention. We always knew in investing that sustainability was going to be about trade-offs. So I might do something invest in a way that was very positive for the environment, but it might have unintended social consequences. And so as an investor, I needed to think through that and figure out if that was an appropriate trade-off for me to make, how that would impact returns in the long term. So I think we did ourselves a disservice, in the last sort of, 10, 12 years ago in, trying to conceive of sustainable investing through the lens of this one 3-letter acronym.
What would you do? How would you affect a change in that regard? What would you do differently? What would you have done differently with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps?
So I think it's already happening that people now talk about, if they do still talk about ESG investing, they talk about E, S, and G. So the notion that we've got 3 discrete variables here, and that each of them is important and has a role to play. So maybe that sounds very trite and very obvious, but it's an important change and will hopefully help to cause a shift in mentality.
And I feel like oftentimes, given that, to your point, we started this conversation having just come off the back of Storm Dara over the last weekend here in the UK, climate change, rightly, due to the impact that it has on so many, can feel quite gloomy, is the word I want to use, master of understatement this morning, but it can inevitably feel gloomy. And to my point, as an eternal optimist and a genuine sense that, the good will prevail, the human spirit will prevail, that not least the intellect and innovation, that there's some incredible, talented, smart people out there doing incredible things. That gives me hope that actually we can solve these issues, we can solve these problems. What emerging trends or innovations give you hope for the future of sustainability?
Yeah, I think the one which I'm currently or about to embark upon, this idea of nature as a service and contractual payments around that, I think is going to be a real game changer over the next several decades. I think what it means is that we'll start to see, large scale institutional capital allocation to nature in a meaningful way, where we're talking about, several percent of overall pension funds or insurance company assets are allocated to nature in a way that allows for payment and ecosystem services, and not just for carbon and biodiversity, but actually for water, flood risk, wildfire resilience. There's a whole raft of things that we can be doing out there. And if we are to deploy even a couple of percentage points of pension fund allocation, that is such a huge sum that it ought to be potentially hugely transformational.
And what about with respect to perhaps the one change or a change in how businesses operate globally? If you could see one change, what would it be and why?
I think the biggest change that will happen is that businesses will start to put a value on nature. Now, I would argue that we've got new metrics, the seed biocomplexity index being one of those, and its 9 underlying foundational blocks. But it almost doesn't really matter what it is. It simply means, we need businesses to start doing that, to understand their impact upon nature, and then in a double materiality sense, to also understand their dependencies on nature. And I think that's probably the single biggest change that will happen, that will be impactful over the next couple of years.
And do you mean, therefore, that the longer term, just so I can unpick and understand, the longer term value that we place upon nature? The thing that comes up in my mind is, for a daft example perhaps, but deforestation. So I can attribute a value, an economic value, to an area of square mileage or square kilometres or whatever. Cut down this number of trees, generates that many logs, price of lumber. Therefore, there's an economic output that I can attribute to. So at the moment, the equation is based around what do I get from nature today? It's back to that kind of today versus tomorrow argument. Is it more of that sort of longer term investing? So if I'm putting back, I'm then looking at the long term value that I'm deriving from my investment in that asset from a natural perspective, and it becomes about return on investment over a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year period, as opposed to what I'm going to make this month.
I think it's both long term and actually short term too. And
right.
What I mean by that is, we know from the work of Tom Crowther and his co-authors that there are about 3 trillion trees on our planet today, down from a peak of around 6 trillion.
Goodness me.
And if we just took degraded forestry land that isn't being used for farming today, there's at least space for another 1 trillion. Now, yes, that's a long-term issue because it takes a long time for trees to grow. But actually, it's really important today because of the hydrology cycle. The importance of trees to creating water vapor, which is such a key theme when it comes to dealing with global warming. And interestingly, we have to go back to the 1970s when Jimmy Carter turned to I think he was his chief scientist, Charles Keating, and asked him, what's the issue with global warming? And he chose to describe it in terms of carbon rather than the hydrology cycle. And I think he might have done us a slight disfavor then, in the sense that we now have this massive focus on carbon. But it turns out that actually in the atmosphere, carbon only accounts for roughly 10%. Water vapor is far more important. And for water vapor, we need trees, we need forests. So actually, we can go a long way to combating global warming if we are serious about, revegetation, reforestation, afforestation, and that's the sort of thing that we can start to make a difference, a meaningful difference, even in the short term.
You talked about, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when we got onto the subject of, if you like, legacy, let's call it that, you talked about your grandsons, the grandchildren. What excites you about the future? What you mentioned nature as a service, as an emerging trend, if you like, or an innovation. But what else excites you? Are you positive about our future prospects?
Yeah, I am. I think I'm a bit like you. I think I'm an eternal optimist. So actually, I do think that there's a world that we can create, which keeps many of the wonderful advances and benefits that we've enjoyed over the last couple of centuries, but also readdresses the balance between humans and the planet as a whole. And that, for me, and that goal, if we can achieve that, that would be a wonderful thing. So I remain super optimistic that we have we have the knowledge and the wherewithal to do it. It's got to do with having the will to actually make it happen.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing. If you could go back in time, Eoin, to 21-year-old Eoin Murray, what would you tell yourself? What message would you give yourself?
That's a really tricky question. If for no other reason than path dependency, i.e. in the sense that I wouldn't necessarily be where I am today if I was to go back and have a serious world with 21-year-old me.
Similarly,
almost inevitably, I'd be telling myself to do some things differently.
Yeah.
Anyway, that being said, I don't think, because of that path dependency, I don't think I'd seek to change very much at all, in the sense that, arguably we have had to have traveled the journey we've been on to be where we are today. So it's very difficult to know what I would go back and say to that younger me. I talk to my children and their friends today, and some of them are interested in studying economics. And one of the recommendations I will say to them is, well, if you're serious about economics, make it a little bit more niche. Go and study environmental economics or ecological economics, but don't just study mainstream economics. For me, it's a profession which hasn't properly, updated in the educational sense to adjust to this new world that we're living in. And, we we reward our most famous and notable economists with Nobel Prizes. But, for example, in the last decade, we gave an award to William Nordhaus, who did a huge amount of work on the economic impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, Nordhaus's modeling today is recognized as being sort of seriously flawed. The damage functions that don't represent reality, no accounting of tipping points, and so on. And I fear that mainstream economics today still doesn't recognize the realities of where we're actually at.
Eoin, thank you for bearing with me on my several butchered sort of thesis and concepts that I was promoting based on little factual evidence and very limited understanding. But nonetheless, you've been incredibly patient and incredibly insightful. And I really appreciate your perspective, really challenged my thinking. And I think given us cause for optimism. I think, as I say, I like you, an eternal optimist, but I do believe that we're very fortunate that there are people like you in this world who are wrapping your not all too inconsiderable intellect around some of these really complex challenges that will ultimately be responsible for changing the way we think, we behave, we act from an economic perspective, ultimately to have a huge long-term beneficial impact on the future of of the planet. And I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but we're lucky to have you. So really appreciate you taking the time out to share some of your ideas and your story with us today. It's been hugely insightful, and I'm really appreciative of your time.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. And I love all of the theories that we've shared.
Let's not write a book about when need becomes must, I think.
Well, that's the title of the book.
Yes. It's the research that might require
you need a snappy title.
Yes, absolutely. But thank you. And I wish you well. I look forward to watching you continue to flourish and to thrive and to challenge consensus, challenge opinion, affect change to the extent that you are. As I say, we're lucky that there are people like you on this wonderful planet that are taking a vested interest in the greater good.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this thought-provoking conversation with Eoin Murray. His vision of connecting finance with nature is a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a sustainable future. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love your support. Leave us a review, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on social media for updates and highlights. And don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at extrology.com for exclusive behind-the-scenes content and early access to upcoming episodes. Join the Extrology community. Together, let's turn inspiration into action. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Just a reminder, today's podcast is brought to you by Progresso Talent Partners. Visit www.progressotalent.com today for more information.